All right, everybody, we have a little bit of problem with our friends in the Middle East, the Saudis, the people that basically control the supply and demand of oil. If they produce more oil and more barrels per day, our prices in the West, in the United States, in Europe, they decrease. And even all across the world, they decrease. If they produce less oil per day, our prices go up because demand stays the same. If there's less supply, then prices have to go up. Basic supply and demand theory, the Saudis control pretty much the entire basis for how oil is produced from a global monetary perspective. Joe Biden went so far as visiting the Prince of Saudi Arabia about 4 months ago in September 2022 and gave him a little fist bump and said, hey man, are we cool? Because I'm trying to get reelected and these gas prices are not helping. And if you guys just, put up another 20,000 barrels a day, that'll really help. Well, the Saudis have started to explore some other options. Saudi Arabia is open to discuss non-dollar oil trade settlements. I mean, this is a bombshell piece of news. Now, do I think this is actually going to happen in the long term? I think the Saudis are a little bit smarter than that, but let's see some of the analysis on what they think could be done. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest crude oil exporter, is open to discussing oil trade settlements in currencies other than the US dollar. Saudi Minister of Finance says, I don't think we are waving away or ruling out any discussion that will help improve the trade around the world. Basically saying, F you, President Biden, you need to realize that we are not beholden to the mighty US dollar and we'll do things differently. During a visit to Saudi Arabia last month, President Xi Jinping, the guy who runs China, pledged to ramp up efforts to promote the use of yuan in energy deals. Now, before we go further into this, why is this important? Obviously, if the US dollar is not the reserve currency that is being used to export and import and trade one of the biggest assets in the world, one of the biggest commodities in the world, which is oil and energy and our ability to actually use that oil and energy to get everything done. It runs the world. Planes, cars, our cell phones, renewable energy, all of it at the end of the day is powered by some form of oil, at least for now. If the Saudis that control that market by the sheer fact that they had their land on top of a lot of oil, decide to not use the reserve dollar currency as the basis by which they trade, that simply gives more power from a global macro perspective to another currency. So the reason the dollar has been the reserve currency and the reason that's a good thing is because people have trusted the dollar. Even the United States, over $20 trillion in debt. There's a lot of economists that argue that our debt doesn't even matter because the dollar is still the reserve currency. So that debt will never hurt inflation. It will never lead to hyperinflation. We'll have, inflation like we've had about 9.1% back in June 2022, but it will always be resolved at some level because everyone in the world trusts, even our adversaries trust in the US dollar. And as a result of that, that gives a lot of power. Now, what is the US dollar even backed by? Have you ever thought of that question? Like, okay, so people care about the US dollar, they care about the value that the US dollar have, but why? It's not just because America is the greatest and freest and most profoundly advanced democracy. It's what we are willing to do to protect that, which is our military. The US dollar is backed by one of the largest militaries in the world, one of the strongest militaries in the world, and a military that has defeated all our adversaries throughout since 1776 to gain our freedom and hold on to these Western values and freedoms that have basically been the hallmark of our existence, right? There's probably no other place in the world that you would want to rather be other than a place that is democratic. Now, people may disagree, but the far majority of people want to live in a democracy. As a result of that, we've created a culture and a literal moat across our ability to be able to protect the US dollar, and that's why companies or countries still use it. If that changes, the power dynamic of the United States also changes, and that power shifts to different regimes that have the reserve currency backed with some of the largest assets in the world, like crude. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest crude oil exporter, is open to discussing oil trade settlements in currencies other than the US dollar. The Saudi signaled that it could be open to talks about oil trade arranged in non-dollar currencies could be another threat to the current dominance of the US dollar in global oil trade. There are no issues with discussing how we settle our trade agreements, whether it is in the US dollar, whether it is a euro, or whether it is in the Saudi riyal. Now, if it's in the euro, it's not the worst. If it's in the Canadian dollar, not the worst. If it's in the yuan or Russian currency, the ruble is what it's called. It probably, or the ruble, something like that. It probably won't be the Russian currency because Russia's economy is falling apart. But if it's China, that's not a good thing. And we'll talk more about it in a second. The Saudi royal has been pegged to the US dollar for decades, while the Saudi oil experts continue to support the petrodollar system from the 1970s, in which the world's top oil exporter prices its crude in US dollars. However, Saudi Arabia is willing to deepen its strategic cooperation with oil trade in China, the world's largest crude oil exporter. China, for its part, plans to make its own currency, the yuan, more prominent in international oil trade. And then the article simply talks about how both leaders met the other day when they actually met in China. Now, so here is the problem. The yuan and China having control over crude oil, or having their currency pegged as one of the basis, as one of the largest benefactors of crude oil, is a bad thing because China gets more power. And if China gets more power, that's not good for anybody. In particular, it's not good for the United States that's struggling right now with a crisis, which is, how do we help Ukraine defeat Russia? And this is how this plays out. If Ukraine is able to beat Russia, it is more likely than not that China will not invade Taiwan. If Ukraine cannot beat Russia, or it is like 60-40 Russia wins, even though there's some compromise, there is a very high possibility, and you can ask people in Taiwan, I've watched many documentaries of people in Taiwan saying it's not a question of when or if, it's a question of when. If China feels that they have the Saudis on their side, and that they have the new global currency that is backed by crude oil, or that is used to back crude oil, and again, oil and energy, as I said in the beginning of this, runs everything. So if the yuan is specifically correlated with that, why wouldn't they feel more comfortable going after Taiwan? They have a lot of reasons that are deeply philosophical for why they want to do this, but if they have the currency and the energy allies to be able to go to do this, I mean, obviously this is not going to be a good thing for the United States. If the Russia-Ukraine compromise ends up with Russia seeming like they basically won, and China feels like they can invade Taiwan, it sets a horrible global precedent. And that global precedent is that any company or any country that feels that they don't need to protect or don't need to care for the sovereignty of another nation, especially a nation that's smaller than them and that can't protect themselves as much, leaves the United States vulnerable. Not necessarily that the United States will be attacked, but rather that if China starts invading all these different countries, Russia starts invading all these different countries, there's other countries Russia has in mind, not just Ukraine, there's many different countries in the area, like Poland, for example, then that is not a good thing, because now we're going backwards in time, not forward in time, where you could respect a country's sovereignty and leave them be. Now you have countries invading other countries. We're getting back into what experts would call a potential World War III scenario. So, I mean, look, I do not think Saudi Arabia is dumb enough to basically say, hey, we're going to peg all of our crude oil exports to this currency versus this currency, when the United States has been a far better ally to the Saudis than China. But we will ultimately see what happens. If this does happen, this is obviously not a good thing for China. Can Joe Biden do anything about it? Probably not. He's just going to have to hope that things don't go the way this happens. I mean, maybe we can offer the Saudis a little bit more of a deal. I know Trump, bought a lot of weapons from them and stuff like that, or we sold weapons to them. So there is a way to make our relationships better, but at what cost does that relationship get better when Saudi Arabia continues to do human rights violations across the world? So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Do you think the dollar will ever fall as the reserve currency when it comes to crude oil? And do you think the yuan has a chance to replace the dollar as the best reserve currency for this particular commodity? Thank you guys so much for listening and watching. I'll see you in the next one.